Fear X, 2003.
Look up there. Nicholas Winding Refn's third feature film is a film that, upon first glance and upon second glance, is very perhaps derivative of the, let's say, corridor and unit block, square, meter, psychological horror of Roman Polanski. And upon third glance and fourth glance, it is undeniably derivative of these forms. And yet, there are times with which this film very eloquently asks and ponders the questions of to what extent knowledge and meaning ascribed to a series of events that we may or may not call a narrative, to what extent is meaning lost the more knowledge is applied toward the events in question.
You know, on the surface, Fear X is it's very much concerned with a lot of things that were very in the public consciousness, being discussed in the artistic sphere a lot in the 90s and 2000s. You know, stuff like surveillance, and there are elements of neo-noir and mystery. It's very much of that cultural zeitgeist. And I think the kind of comparisons that people often make about this film, you know, people will say, oh, it's like Memento, oh, it's like David Lynch. And there's some truth to that. Very, you know, it's a mystery. It's a neo-noir. It's got a lot of these, you know, ominous ambient passages made by Brian Eno. It's very psychological, so on. But I think, to me, perhaps the most interesting thing about this film is it's actually not really that much of a mystery. It's not in the sense that something like Mulholland Drive is. You know, in Mulholland Drive, or well, perhaps Mulholland Drive is the wrong comparison. Not in the way that something like Inland Empire is, or Lost Highway. It's very... The narrative is solved of this film. Like, when the film finishes, there's no mystery left. We know exactly what happened. There's no room for contemplation. We know the motive behind the killing of Harry Kane's wife. We know who did it. We know we've seen the confrontation with the killer. Like, nothing is left in mystery. The only sort of sleight of hand there is that, you know, it was all a dream, right? That's sort of how it plays. Then, so in the end, the film that I feel like it resembles the most, rather than the sort of mystery neo-noirs, is actually The Brown Bunny. Not just for the surface similarity that it's a film about someone looking for a blonde woman of their past who, you know, spoiler alert, turns out to be dead in The Brown Bunny. You know, with them making guest appearances in the mind of our protagonist. There's also that beyond just those surface similarities, I also feel like you have this general construction where there's a lot of sort of washed out photography. It's very much set in a rural area. You know, our protagonist is drifting about from place to place. I mean, the films are both resolved with these nebulous half endings, right? The Brown Bunny, you know, we have the truth revealed after the infamous blowjob scene. In this film, we have, you know, this climactic confrontation, and then we have the truth revealed. But one thing that I feel like is very different between the two films, and I was really noticing this the first time I saw it, is films like those of Lynch, even somewhat something like Memento, they're very American. right? Like they geographically, temporarily, they can only really be in America at a certain place in time. That's the frame of reference. It's like critical to the film. Whereas in Fear X, I feel like, you know, Refn could have made this film in Denmark. He could have made this film at home. It would have been almost, there would have almost no difference. It'd be the exact same film. And in fact, I feel like the it might actually be more at home in Denmark. You think about some of these kind of Thomas Alfredson type stuff. I mean, like that sort of aesthetic, that sort of style is here. Like that is just that has been sort of plopped down into Middle America without really going through many changes. The only other thing I really have to say about it is the way it looks, which is, you know, it's obviously a very precise production. You know, you can see that every shot is very deliberately framed. Meticulous work goes into the textures. You know, it's very controlled in terms of the color and the style of the film. The aesthetic moments that caught my eye the most were really the abstract ones, because I think, you know, it is such a well-made production. It is a very precise production. Some of that stuff looks really good, like the way that they utilized video, which is such a big part of the film. I don't think they were particularly saying anything about video and surveillance in the way that, you know, a similar film like Red Road is very much commenting on video and surveillance. It is used for like this really nice ominous effect. Some of the abstract visuals, like they have this like red face coming through like what feels like a surface, a transparent surface. You have this red face like sticking through it a little bit, writhing around, like sort of shows up as a motif. And later you have this like barrage of like these red abstract visuals. And if it weren't for like the score, which is at that point it's a bit tacky, a bit of this like sort of tacky, ominous noise at the climax of the film. I mean, I could imagine an experimental filmmaker making something like that. You know, a less polished version being made by Brakhage or someone like that. Some of just like the location shots that divide up the narrative, that just sort of come and go very briefly, are quite nice. Generally, the photography is very good.
Where I found this film interesting is that, to what degree are answers going to satisfy the viewer or not? You brought up an interesting point in that you felt as though there was a degree of clarity to this film compared to other films of a more, say, ambiguous nature. I find that's extremely interesting, because there are a lot of potential answers given toward the end of this film. To get into the territory of spoiling the narrative, there is an implication toward the end that the bosses, the superiors in the police of the man whom Harry is believed to have murdered, seem to be under sort of pretense to cover this murder up, so as to, for their own sake, and they made it very clear in an earlier scene when they're discussing with the police officer that they do not want the reputation of the force harmed whatsoever, and they will do whatever it takes to preserve that. And they are similarly maddened that this police officer had been responsible for Harry's wife's demise. And so there's an implication that there was a conspiracy of a kind of ambiguous, let's leave it unknown justice at play. It's a strange case.
Yeah,
it doesn't fall into Lynchian category, and it doesn't quite fall into the category of the conspiracy thrillers either. Compared it to Thomas Alfredson. So in some ways, this film reminded me of a film that came out, admittedly 7 years later, But Christopher Bowes' "Everything Will Be Fine" is a very succinct, very precise conspiracy narrative. The conspiracy is clear, the conspirators are clear, the object of the conspiracy is clear. It's very grounded in the real world. We're talking about war crimes.
Yeah.
And this film takes the approach of imbuing a kind of psychological, is this real? Is reality? Lynchian, soft Lynchian touches, one might say, which make it, let's say, close. There's a what would you say? There's a current that seems to be moving it toward Lynchian territory, say Lost Highway. Yet there's also, there's at the same time there's something more grounded about it, more simply symmetrical and purely subjectively psychological in a really nightmarish, garish sense. Say a film that reminds me of its aesthetic to some extent. Maybe because it's also set in a shopping mall, though much more extensively. And that's 2002's 1 Hour Photo, which I remember it makes me recall that film occasionally because I feel as though they're two films that take place at the turn of the century when a kind of clarity of mind, seemingly implied by the kind of post 2000 consensus of comfort and material existence, something's not quite right, and there's still a sense, I don't know, for all the attempts at the shopping mall, for instance, or the hotel room to be comforting, there's something unnerving about it. Refn and Hubert Selby Jr., the screenwriter of the film, also an accomplished author of Last Exit to Brooklyn, most famously, 1964, considered a classic American novel, and the novel and screenplay for the novel which the film is based off of, and the screenplay for the film, Requiem for a Dream. Selby and Refn apparently had lots of discussions and extensive, according to Refn, yelling arguments over where they wanted the film to go. Refn reportedly wanted Harry to end up in Brazil. They both did agree on that this film was supposed to be a series of walls. The extent to which they wanted the walls to dominate the plot appeared to have ultimately, again according to Refn in various interviews, including with The Guardian and the BBC, they opted for more walls rather than none. A infamous quote from Refn regarding this film is, quote, "What the fuck is even an ending?" unquote. That's a very crude, garish way of looking at it, and frankly, it does invite criticisms of the film in that it if you will, throws the baby out for the bathwater, treats Dangerous to decapitation, rather than doing anything truly interesting by merging ambiguity with a serious grounded narrative. It instead opts for simply taking out a piece of the puzzle. But that being said, I do think it is very interesting. My experience as a viewer, Refn himself stated that he knew nothing he could reveal would be truly as interesting as the tension, as the build-up. And insofar as it's an admission of defeat from a storyteller, this is very fascinating. Insofar as it invites us as a viewer to exercise our own imaginations and come up with something infinitely more pleasurable than the constraints of another person's fixed set narrative might be. That being said, it is hardly impressive in this respect as a piece of narrative weaving. It merely invites us to fill in those gaps in many respects. Though the scaffolds are very interesting, very atmospheric. The photography is claustrophobic and yet symmetrical and comfortable, like the hotel room it takes place in. There's a sense of not that one might be attacked or be subjugated to something dangerous, but there is no preconception that one might be comfortable, cozy in this room either.
I mean, the hotel in particular, the way they've lit it is very, it's luminous. It's a lot of the expansive displays of light, color. Like, it's very well color coordinated red. And you have that to speak to the sense of whether it's comfortable. You have that strange scene where Harry Kane is like propositioned by this woman who just walks into his room after they sort of hint towards it earlier, where they have this bit where they say, we have all kinds of entertainment. The implication is kind of weird. Like, what do you make of that?
That the protagonist is walking through a world, much like a Polanski character, and then one might suggest much like the Kafka protagonist that preceded Polanski. There's a sense that the character is wandering around a world that is encouraging him to commit vice, if for no other reason than it wants to persecute and punish those that do in order to give itself a sense of meaning. In the scene where Harry's being questioned over to what extent he knew his wife, as more information has come out about potentially who killed her, the police make a suggestion that, and Harry hasn't really considered it that much apparently, that 7 years is only the amount of time he's known his wife. That's not a huge amount of time. That's a fraction of someone's life. That's only a small surveyed glimpse of someone's life. And even they suggest that while they went on, were you been anywhere recently? You went on a holiday. Did you know where she was the whole time? Much as that police officer, the man who murdered Harry's wife, is, in as much as he is confused about Harry's intentions, Harry is very confused about his intentions. There's a lack of communication throughout the smaller individuals in this world, and yet this film illustrates an America where there are small individuals with daily lives, be it Harry. Well, what's very interesting is Harry himself is part of a structure that accuses people of a crime and sets about trying to remove comfort from their lives as a result of a duty to authority. He accosts an elderly couple who he suspects to have been stealing an item, and the film initially seems to make it apparent that to us, the viewer, based upon the editing and the reaction of the elderly couple, that so Harry's done his job well. The following scenes featuring Harry walking into a very grimy and claustrophobic set compared to the vast clarifying expanse of the mall, and then in this subterranean hell of the back rooms of the mall, the security officers, he's scolded by his officers in a manner that's not too dissimilar to the way the police officer later in the film is scolded by his superiors for having taken an innocent as a criminal also. There's a lot of interesting parallels with characters' lack of knowledge, finding a meaning, and I mean, did Harry simply find meaning where there was none in order to justify his existence? It's an interesting query.
You spoke a little bit earlier about like the sense of fear and dread evoked by this film. Did you think it was scary, or did you think there was a really ominous tone? Because obviously that's what it's angling for, right? It is very much trying to be ominous and filled with fear and dread.
This film is interesting to me in that perhaps this is overtly subjective, a description of its effects, although I do think it does speak to a degree to which the film is emphasized or not. And that's that this film never really gets to a point wherein it becomes truly intentionally frightening or horrific. We're always seemingly a few steps away from it. We never go into the territory of being, perhaps these are superficial genre categorizations. This never falls into, there is no scene in this film that is definitively the product of a horror film. There are scenes in David Lynch films which are very arguably the byproduct of some kind of inspiration or potential association with tropes of the horror genre. Fear X never quite leaves the thriller genre.
It never quite enters the area of unreal, truly unreal, or the supernatural. Anything unreal in this film is overwhelmingly ambiguous. And yeah, we have a film which is dancing with the fear, dare I suggest, that what it uncovers, the answers, the conclusion, the ending, is never going to be enough, and so we're just going to frankly masturbate with the prospect but never truly reach the climax. And it edges and edges and edges and edges, becoming something so psychologically affecting that it never becomes the complete experience. And it's almost as though...
The complete experience of fear?
Yes.
Okay.
And the complete experience of fear is never truly conjured because, again, it was... In the horror film, we're always waiting for that moment. In The Shining, for instance, inevitably we have the scenes of blood, of visceral fright, of strange imagery, of gore. These come to us, and these things, and suddenly, oh, that's why. Yes, I had a reason to be so frightened. Here it is. Or take Polanski's The Tenant. He does jump out of the building at the end. There is no moment like this in Fear X. Fear X.
The shooting?
That's an interesting. It almost comes to that spot so close.
It's played in such a strange way, though, right? Like in that scene, he's holding him like a, like a lover. Basically, he's holding his head, and it's like this weird, close, and emotional scene.
Yes.
It's hard to know what to make of it because like he's shot in the peak of this like emotional intensity. He backs away, with both the actors sort of shaking, and then we depart. That's it. That's all that we see, really. He takes an elevator down a floor, and then, we get abstract visuals. But then we're on to the denouement. Like we're on to the aftermath without seeing the full event of what happened. I mean, how about in comparison to something like Vertigo, which obviously it's such a legendary film, but really plays with the same idea in terms of, it's suspenseful, but there's often, it's that thing, I forget what it's from. It's like that idea of a ball falling off a table, like a ball rolling to the end of a table, and this suspense of, is it going to fall off? And then it falls off. Like, it's sort of mysterious, and it doesn't really feel fulfilling. And that's the whole context of what, sorry, that's not the whole context, but that's the whole idea of what is going on in Vertigo. Like that, it's like that quintessential non-ending, the mystery, the layers of mystery that will never unpack. Was there ever really anything there of much significance? And for me, in Fear X, I didn't really find it to be that sinister a viewing experience. I mean, you have Harry Kane, John Turturro. He's doing all the quaking and shaking, going through all this torment and trauma. But, like, as an audience member, you don't really sympathize with him that much because he's such a bizarre, strange character, right? Like he doesn't really in the whole film, he doesn't really interact normally with another character except potentially briefly at the restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he doesn't have normal human interactions.
Yeah.
And so I guess through that character, you see the fear, you see the anticipation and dread. But, like, did I viscerally feel it? Not really. You know, you have that droning sort of dark ambient score from Brian Eno, but in terms of what I was actually feeling, it felt very empty. Like, I felt similar to how when I was watching The Brown Bunny, right? Like, there's a lot of scenes that are expansive and spacious and dialogue minimal, that really, to me, they just evoke a sense of emptiness.
Fear X, so much of the appeal of Fear X to me is going to come across as perhaps a point of criticism of the film. Fear X has me fantasizing about the kind of film it could be, but isn't quite. And perhaps that makes, in a strange way, this is the film being successful. Because I almost get the impression that this is almost what the director and screenwriter Refn and Selby Jr. had intended. Although there's a degree to which I really would love to consider this film a kind of midnight, transcending, terrifying experience. And there are other films I could perhaps nominate, some of which I've mentioned them, to be this sort of experience, be it David Lynch's Inland Empire, Polanski's The Tenant, Kubrick's The Shining, any number of terrifying, labyrinthine films. Frankly, speaking of John Turturro, even Barton Fink, to some degree, is an example of this sort of film. Now, that's a film that's very heavy on a thematic undercurrent and is explored a lot in dialogue. So, well, that film's labyrinthine in a very in a contextual analysis sense as well. But nevertheless, but Fear X is the kind of film that, if viewed in this context, and I have, frankly, leaves me cold. But I can't help but feel at the back of my mind that coldness is at least one element of the film's success. And while it doesn't, but there's another part of my brain which can't help but feel that certainly if I'd made this film and I went through so much effort to imbue it in so much cinematic residue, in something so otherworldly, and it's still intending to leave the viewer cold at the end, I don't know. I guess why I'm fascinated with this film is I don't know how to feel about it. It's infinitely less successful than the films I've compared it to, but I cannot dismiss it either, that it can't be on the same shelf as these films. It's a strange case. I wanted to be more. I wanted to be so much more, and insofar as I do want it to be more, perhaps the film has succeeded in what it attempted. It's an intriguing film that it will never be at the top of any of my lists, but I'm not going to forget it, especially because as someone who the films I compared Fear X to are some of my absolute favorite films. I love the mystery. I love not knowing. I prefer not knowing. And in Fear X, I feel like I've been taken advantage of as someone, sometimes, to the extent I feel like I've been taken advantage of as someone who likes not knowing, in that they haven't given me enough. 2001: A Space Odyssey still explained, for instance, this is a joke, but it still explained the origins of man in its own unclear way. I don't know. In Mulholland Drive still made it very clear that the psychological chemistry of its players and the clashing emotions that they were dealing with Fear X points out the most, like it was suggested, imbues all the information, all the other puzzle pieces are there, and then it removes one,
Which is?
well, it's a few pieces, I suppose. It's what happened in the where there's those abstract. It's essentially, to put it in a nutshell, what happened when there were abstract visuals. What happened when we couldn't decipher when it became truly otherworldly, what was going on. And it's so blatant a avoidance of the answer that it's in a sense it almost breaks the illusion that I'm viewing a story, and then that kind of I start to think of, unfortunately I can't help but think of a filmmaker slash screenwriter who didn't quite know where to go with it, rather than having a few ideas and choosing not to reveal what they are. And well, Fear X really is a good baseline for me, and it's a testament to the degree to which I like knowing what's going on in a narrative. I like, it's worth starting out on the mystery. Yeah, we start enjoying the visceral experience rather than the, let's say, the intellectual exercise of putting pieces together. Rather, the visceral journey is now what's more interesting. We discard the photographs that we've been collecting for the films Harry has, and we drive off to resume life because there's enough mystery to uncover, and there's before we start digging up more of our own.
That makes me sort of think, you were saying like it's almost like intentional that the film isn't Vertigo. It isn't, a typical piece of that sort of mystery canon of films that are just like very slippery and have that sense of twisting and turning mystery and aren't truly resolved, but like go in those provoking and have that element of thriller and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said that is intentional, and I think that really fits in with how Refn has talked about the film. But then I think, like, to what degree do you think that that's like a valid direction to go with a film like this? Like, to what degree was it valid for Refn to do that? In the sense that, like, it works, right? Like, in the sense that that idea innately works, like, of having a Vertigo where the pieces kind of fall together in there. You know what I mean?
Yes. The film can never work in the same way that a film like Vertigo works, because Vertigo, all things considered, seemed to have a very clear idea of what it wanted to communicate. There's a lot going on in Vertigo from Hitchcock's, well, let's just presume Hitchcock's beliefs about narrative, his experience in build-up and payoff, his view on what appears to be a commentary, or at least a exploration on the engine that is sex and gender in film storytelling, especially Hollywood storytelling, and then the degree to which films become unreal, like dreams. All of these are so blatantly on display in Vertigo, to the degree which, for instance, it's not all that surprising, for instance, that Vertigo alienated critics and audiences at the time. To a contemporary audience, it's almost, we watch other 50s films, and Vertigo does appear as though a very pointed, almost philosophically charged film compared to its contemporaries, whereas Fear X does. I compared it. Comparing Fear X as much as I did to 1 Hour Photo is very much a case of perhaps this is evident that compared to Vertigo, for instance, Fear X does not work in the same way because Fear X is not really based off of any ideas. It's purely rooted in narrative for narrative's sake, mystery for mystery's sake. But there's nothing about Vertigo deals in the fundamental strangeness of the human condition in a way that Fear X merely roots it in our perception of fictional narratives in an almost it might be a bit rash to throw the postmodern around here, but it's I do think it's rooted in a kind of text is for text's sake and not Vertigo dealing with, I think, mysteries that Western art, for instance, has been dealing with for a long time. We have, evocations of the great works of art dealing with the kind of, I guess we would say, the Helen of Troy model of storytelling, the male gaze upon the female, and especially in the context of Hollywood, how this drives towards narrative, experience, motivation, and energy and endeavor in general. Yeah, in this respect, it's almost fair to say that there's a kind of cynicism in Fear X, as opposed to existential woes that one feels bleeding out of Vertigo, the blood being presumably Alfred Hitchcock's own. Of course, there's not an extensive amount of interviews of Alfred Hitchcock talking about Vertigo as opposed to Refn about Fear X. So that's why, perhaps in this ironic respect, not knowing the creative context of Vertigo from Alfred Hitchcock's perspective does make it a more evocative piece of thematic substance. But at the same time, there is so much more to gauge from the film. There's so much more decisions on display, where in Fear X seems to opt to have not made decisions in the same way.
I feel what you're saying. Like, I'm getting this picture emerging of like a writer trying to write a screenplay and having nothing to say, and then the mystery becoming about not having nothing to say. The message of the film is that this film has nothing to say. Like, the whole mystery is what is meaning? What should I?
They start to feel like tropes for tropes' sake, rather than Vertigo questioning why are these tropes here, and to what degree can we torment our players and our viewers through the lens of through the gaze of the player, in this case Scotty James Stewart, to what degree explore what kind of manipulation of these tropes can do in a way that's evoked in the narrative and stylistically in the film's aesthetic. This is nothing close to this level of filmmaking, narrative, creative sophistication is on display in Fear X, as it were. Mind you, we are talking about a film, possibly the most critically acclaimed film of all time in Vertigo, so it's almost an unfair comparison. But I still feel as though it is worth bringing up, because I feel like there is a if it weren't for narratives like Vertigo, films like Fear X, the meaning behind Refn's motivation for questioning what the fuck is even an ending. Well, films like Vertigo really set the precedent for endings and conclusions having a very definitive. Because Vertigo's ending is it's an ending. It assumes it has nothing more of significance to say, even though the story, Scotty's life clearly goes on. There's clearly more to Scotty's life. There's clearly more that could occur of interest potentially, but the film's ending is very decisive. Actually, I think Alfred Hitchcock did answer the question, what the fuck is even an ending? And the ending is where we need to leave the cinema and start thinking about what we just saw, and Theater X didn't give us quite enough to think about compared to Vertigo.
Well, and it makes me think, talking about Alfred Hitchcock as the creator of endings, I recently rewatched North by Northwest, and the ending of that film, it just like cuts from the climax to a train, and then we see the train going into a mountain. And I saw online someone had said about the film, 2.5 hours of sexual innuendo, and then the train goes into the big hole.
Yeah.
And I thought that was so apt. Yeah, Hitchcock was pretty strong with endings sometimes. But with regard to what you were saying about Fear X in, you know, how it fits in that strain of films that, you know, are somehow related to Vertigo in the way that they have a degree of obstruction, and they obscure things from the viewer, and they use mystery in sort of unintuitive ways. Like, how's this for an idea? You have like films like Vertigo and, you know, other films that I'm not thinking of now. Perhaps you have, like, you could say the primal soup of like mystery films dating back to the 30s and the silent era. And then you have a film like Vertigo that really uses that form and turns it into something new, and becomes a formative work for that style of screenwriting and filmmaking. Then you have some of the films that people often compare Theater X to. You have films like Mulholland Drive and other Lynch films, and you have Memento, and you have, you know, Barton Fink. All these kind of films, you know, there are many of them. They were very popular once upon a time. But, you know, and you know, what they essentially do is they take that sort of conceptual framework of Vertigo and they mutate it into different, you know, they take it in a more a direction of like deeper psychological trauma, or they make it darker or whatever. Like it draws that influence and it perverts the form in some way. And then you have, so like you have Vertigo as like the founding text, and then you have all these other films as like the applications. And then in a way, in that sense, you could say something like Fear X is like the final form. It's like that concept just turned onto itself. It's like an Ouroboros of just like questioning the form itself. Like, what am I doing? Like, what is this? And you can sort of read that as sort of like this masterful, grand idea or narrative.
Yeah.
Or you can interpret it how I did before, which is the way that I am prone to, I guess, which is that it's a writer who had no ideas, sort of going through the motions of writing something of a certain style, and then the point becoming that there is no idea here.
Yes. I think it's very succinct, and I don't think I could have put it better myself. I think that's exactly
probably
a lot of what I was trying to get at, especially it being kind of attempt at a final form, which may or may not come through.